All right. Well, we're going to get started. Before I click on this, this will be our last one on Ecclesiastes, even though we're not going to finish it quite yet. This will be our last one. Next week, for the next several weeks, we're going to be doing one on spiritual gifts. Then we'll come back and finish Ecclesiastes. So just so you are aware. All right. Welcome back to Ecclesiastes, and we are on verse 13. There is a sickening tragedy I have seen under the sun, wealth kept by its owner to his harm. And I asked, what is the purpose of wealth? And is it a sin to be wealthy? And to this, we go to Jesus, where he says, it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than it is for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. But at the same time, Jesus counted on a rich man, Joseph of Arimathea, to loan him a tomb when he died. He required the rich to often support his ministry because the Bible tells us that many of the women who were wealthy supported his ministry. And so when we see this, the question is not, is wealth bad, but how it can be kept to harm you. Ezekiel 16, now this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, plenty of food, and comfortable security, but didn't support the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me, so I removed them when I saw this. We went through this verse last week, and it's interesting because it says, in addition to the other sins, what may have been the tipping point was God saying, I had given all of this wealth, all of these beautiful things, and they chose not to share them. They chose to keep them only for themselves. Luke 18, and the rich young ruler, what must I do in order? And Jesus says, sell everything you have, give your money to the poor, then come and follow me. And he says, I can't do it. My money's too important to me right now. And our prayer is always that the rich young ruler later in his life was able to say, I now understand the value of following Jesus versus the value of stuff. Verse 14, that wealth was lost in a bad venture, so when he fathered his son, he was empty-handed. Is there any promise that a son or daughter will inherit something from their parents? I mean, are we guaranteed that we're going to get something when our parents die? No, not really. And every time that we hear about an extremely wealthy individual who chooses to either cut a particular child or a group of family members out of the will and the lawsuits that consume millions of dollars while they're fighting over all this, or the individuals who assumed that when dad or mom died, they were getting this or they were getting that. And, years ago, and I've never followed up, but years ago, Bill Gates said, I've already set aside money for my children and that's all they get. And it was certainly a lot more than any of us will ever see. But he said they aren't going to inherit the billions. Warren Buffett is the guy who said, I'm going to do my best to spend all my money before I die. And the problem with Warren Buffett is every time he gives away $1 billion, he seems to make $2 billion. And he's struggling with that. But there's no guarantee. The Pentateuch distinguishes clearly between real and personal property. The land belongs to God, given by him to his children, the people of Israel, and hence cannot be alienated. Leviticus 25, verses 23 and 28. God owns the land. We are always leaseholders. We can never own the land. It belongs to God. This is the ultimate biblical teaching. When I came to Hawaii for the first time in the 70s, and I would see they were just beginning to sell fee simple properties. And fee simple meant you owned both the building and the land. But up until that point, Bishop Estate or one of the other large groups in Hawaii owned the property, and they would give you a 99-year lease. And you would pay either monthly or yearly, or you would give them a one-time settlement. Our church in Hilo is on property that is leasehold. And they have, 30 or 40 years left. 4 years ago, when we were looking to sell the DCE's condo and get them a larger unit because they were a family now, because our condo that we purchased was a studio and you could literally touch all the walls by doing this. And, Kayla is now married and we said, let's see what we can do. A church member came in one day and they were super excited. There was a condo 1 block up the road and it was like $50,000 for a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom condo with a lanai and 2 parking places. And of course, we're like, A, it's a scam, or B, there's something wrong with it. So of course, we go back after church, we look it up. Sure enough, it was leasehold and had 3 months lease left, which means at the end of 3 months, you renegotiate the lease with whoever owned it. And we looked that up, and it was going to be about $1 million. And so this individual waited too long, was trying to sell it at the last minute, was probably not going to get anything for their condo. But you see, in the Old Testament, the view was that God owned everything, all the property. And this is why it was set up, and this is why we have the year of Jubilee. Because of necessity, if a homestead was sold, the title could pass only temporarily, for in the year of Jubilee, every homestead must again return to the original owner or heir, Leviticus. And so all the land was divvied up, if you'll remember. And the various tribes got this. The only tribe that didn't get it was the ones who were the priests. But all the property was divvied up. And it belonged to those tribes, and those tribes then divvied it up among the various families. And the families they owned this property. They held the title of this property in perpetuity. But let's say all of a sudden I get myself into financial problems. And so I call up and I say, Emmy, I will sell you my farm. And Emmy says, yes, I will help your family out. She knows whenever the year of Jubilee is going to be, she knows that the year of Jubilee is coming. So what she offers me is enough money, and it has to make sense because she knows in the year of Jubilee, she must return the property to my family, along, by the way, with anything that she built or she did on the property. And so, but it was always to return, which meant that I would know that even if my grandparents or my parents sold off the family inheritance, that in the year of Jubilee, it would be restored to me. Real estate given to the priesthood must be appraised and could be redeemed by the payment of the appraised valuation, thus preventing the transfer of real property, even in this case. So all of a sudden, Janice comes and she says, Pastor, I want to give my property to the church. I'm going to move to Australia. Actually, you would probably move to Tierra del Fuego or Peru. But I'm moving and I'm going to give my property to the church. We accept the property. Now, as the priesthood, by the way, it does me no good. So I sell the property to Mike. Mike buys the property, then the money from the sale goes in to be used for the church. Mike uses the property, but Janice's property is returned to her family in the year of Jubilee. The firstborn son inherits a double portion of all the father's possessions. This is the parable of the prodigal son. The younger son comes and says, Dad, I know you're not dead yet, but I'm really sick and tired of waiting, so give me what is mine. And the older son is supposed to get a double portion. So if there's only 2 of them, they figure out what the valuation is, and they gave the younger son what would have been his at that moment. The daughters were entitled to an inheritance provided there were no sons in the family. But normally the daughters were excluded because they were to be married off and they became part of new families. But if there were no sons, they could receive it. However, there were special conditions that they had to follow. In case there were no direct heirs, the brothers or more distant kinsmen were recognized. In no case should an estate pass from one tribe to another. So in other words, if I have no children and I die, but I do have a brother, now he inherits my portion, but never can my property be given, because if Daniel happens to be from a different tribe, he cannot have my property. My property must stay within my tribe. That way we didn't have to worry about Judah or Benjamin or any of the others, taking over somebody else's. And next thing you know, that, the tribe of Judah no longer has any property because one of the other tribes has taken it all over. Verse 15, as he came from his mother's womb, so he will go again, naked as he came. He will take nothing for his efforts that he can carry in his hands. The same thing appears in Job 1:21. Naked I came from my mother's womb. And in 1 Timothy 6:7, we brought nothing into the world and we cannot take anything out of the world. Solomon is setting up wisdom that gets passed down, and others are saying, when we came into this world, we owned nothing. Now, we may have been born into a wealthy family or a poor family. When we were born, it's possible that we were gifted an inheritance already because mom and dad said, we've set this money aside for you. But we come in and we actually own nothing. And when we die, we can't take anything with us, whether we are saved or not. And so Solomon is looking at it and he's saying, what happens in your life is important. But it's not the measure of your wealth that is going to determine whether or not you have been a good person, a bad person, a successful person, or unsuccessful. So a steward is one who manages or looks after another's property. We were dealing with this in the board of directors this last week because steward is an old-fashioned term. Back when my parents would come to Hawaii on the Lurleen or the Matsonia, they were the stewards who took care of them. And the stewards obviously did not own the ship. They did not own the dining room. They did not own housekeeping, but they managed my parents, and they would come in and they would do the laundry and they would clean the room and they would prepare their dinner and they would do everything that needed to be done. And so they served as though the ship were theirs, taking care of the passengers. In Genesis chapter 1, when God creates the heavens and the earth, he says, I am making you stewards of the earth. The earth does not belong to you, it belongs to me. But I am making you stewards. I am placing everything under your control. You are to manage it. And this is why so many of Jesus' parables were about managers. Because he's saying, your job is to take all I've given you and use it in a proper way to the benefit of those around you. If you remember a couple verses ago when Solomon says there's nothing more sickening than looking out and finding an entire destitute nation, because he says it all points back to the king who failed to take care of his people. Verse 16, this too is sickening tragedy. Exactly as he comes, so he will go. What does the one gain who struggles for the wind? It's rhetorical, yet it's a very painful truth for many people. When we stop and reflect on our life, I read a book a number of years ago. It was about golden parachutes, and it was about individuals who had spent their entire life trying to make money, trying to be successful. And then one day they woke up, and usually there is an event that takes place, and they wake up and they realize that they have money, they have power, they have prestige, they have everything, and yet they're not happy. And they know something that makes them happy. We've got a pastor on the Big Island who runs an orphanage and a care center for children who are otherwise abandoned. And it's his joy. And so he does his pastoral job so that he can do this. And I don't doubt when he retires, I don't know that he and his wife are going to move down there, but I do believe that this will become the focus of his retirement while he sets this up and makes sure that when he either dies or is no longer capable of running it, that somebody else can pick it up so these children and all the good that is taking place continues on. And that's one of those moments when somebody realizes, I am working this job so that I can pay for my hobby, which allows and brings joy to my life. And so Solomon says, if all we're doing is boxing with the wind, he says, we're going to get to the point where we are so tired and so exhausted that we just can't do it anymore. And then he says, how will we and what will we evaluate our life as? Verse 17, What is more, he eats in darkness all his days with much sorrow, sickness, and anger. This is another Hebrew phrase. Darkness equals sorrow and loneliness and maybe a little fear when you eat in darkness. One of the other translations says when you eat alone. You know, it is interesting. Often when I go to the board of directors meetings, I never eat alone. We always eat as a whole board. And we break up into little tables or we all sit around, but we're there. But when I go to a pastor's conference and it's not one of our Lutheran ones and I go to a Saddleback or something, you come back to your hotel at night and it's just you. And whereas most of the hotel is taken up with pastors, you would be hesitant to go to the room next to you, knock on the door and say, "Hi, would you like to get dinner?" Because you have no idea who it is. So unless you meet somebody at the conference and you say, "Hey, you want to go to dinner together?" So you wind up coming back to the hotel. And then you think about it and it's like, well, you know, I don't necessarily want to go to a nice place for dinner because it gets very lonely and boring when you're in a very nice place and you're all alone because, you know, you're looking around, you can only look around for so long. And so you wind up going to a place like Chick-fil-A, In-N-Out Burger. You go to a place that's quick and you're only going to be in there as soon as you get your food, you're going to wolf it down and you're gone in 10 minutes. And you're in the midst of a large crowd, but you're alone. That's different, by the way, than a time when you're set apart for introspection and for contemplation. And so he's saying that these individuals are eating in darkness. Why? Because everyone's afraid of them. They have set themselves up in such a way that they're unapproachable. So last Tuesday, Pon got promoted to full commander. And it was interesting because one of the things that set the service apart was the two-star admiral who walks in and starts glad-handing everybody and asking everybody their history and telling stories about Amy and Pon. And, you know, and so it's funny because we were all standing there when all of a sudden over the PA system for the whole base, what did they say, Pon? District 14 arriving. And Pon goes, "Oh, the admiral's here." And then he doesn't show up for a while. And then they announced him again. It was like he looped back around. But anyway, you know, here he is, the admiral. He's in charge of everything Coast Guard here. And yet he's acting like he's your best friend, even though you never met him before. And, you know, it was an interesting time because when I go to the change of commands and the promotions, and oftentimes you walk in and the high muckety mucks that are there because they have to be, they were invited and they're expected to be there. But as soon as the ceremony, they show up 1 minute before the ceremony begins. And as soon as the ceremony ends, they grab their aids and they're gone. They don't talk to you. You know, they only talk to their peers who have the same amount of gold braid on their hats and shoulder, and they walk away. And this guy comes in and immediately is everybody's friend. And had he stayed and dined with us, he would have sat at a table and eaten with everybody. He would not have wandered off and you know, said, "I can't eat with you people because you're not of my station." And that's one of the things that you look for in this world is people who have that type of personality. Our district president, by the way, Mike has a lot of shortcomings like we all do, but his gift is personal relationships. And when Mike goes somewhere, one of his problems is he will have meetings scheduled every 15 minutes. The problem is he gets into his first meeting and discovers that the individual has got something that needs to be talked about. And when Mike sits down with these individuals, the rest of the world disappears. And Mike's personal assistant is sitting there telling him, and Mike just does this. And now this person has to go and reschedule the next 3 meetings because we're just going to have to shift everything around. Because Mike is with you and you know that he's with you. And this is one of those things that Mike is also very approachable because that's his gift. But we have other individuals who, when they're in the room, they make it very clear that there is a bubble around them and you are not to approach them. And you actually feel sorry for them because they've achieved all this power, prestige, and everything. And yet you know that they're lonely because they want both. They just don't know how to get it. And Solomon says you can't. The secondary meaning is one of warning over trying to control the world or create a perfect place. Solomon recognizes only heaven is perfect, and no matter how hard we try, we will not bring heaven to earth. We must accept the world, but not become part of it. And so he says, when these individuals are off eating in the silence and in the darkness, he says, sometimes they're planning, they're plotting. It's like, how can I get more power? Because if I have more power, if I have more prestige, then I can make the world perfect. And of course, they're designing their own version of perfect. Verse 18, here's what I have seen to be good. It is appropriate to eat, drink, and experience good in all the labor one does under the sun during the few days of his life that God has given him, because that is his reward. We paraphrase this in the 60s and 70s. Eat, drink, and be merry. And there's another verse later on that says, eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow you may die. And that can be used both directions. But Solomon is saying, you have what you have. You can either sit all day suffering, saying, if only I had this, and if only I had this, and if only I had this, or you can enjoy what you actually have. And Solomon is saying now, there is nothing greater than to take what you have and live it out. And he says, everything that's been given to you has been given to you as a gift. Enjoy it. Because he said, if you're waiting for the perfect thing the 7th largest lotto jackpot is up for grabs. We, of course, don't have the lotto here. But it will probably rise even further. Why? Because the moment that somebody hears it's the 7th largest, there's this surge because what happens and what does everybody do? They run and buy a ticket because what are they going to do, Alec? There's a chance. Granted, it's 1 in 100 billion, but there's a chance. And, when my kids, when they're around, I say, hey, buy me a ticket. And I know God won't let me win, but it's okay. But it's one of those things that, and he says, and yet at the same time, he says, sometimes we need those dreams, but we cannot allow our life to become such that if we don't achieve this dream, our life is ruined. Solomon does not condemn the wealthy or eating and drinking, but rather warns against it being the purpose of life or the meaning of life. He said there's nothing wrong with eating, drinking, and being merry. And this is important for us to understand. There are times when we see someone celebrating and we think it's inappropriate. And I'll just bring up, if you remember David and Bathsheba, they commit sin. The child is the product of their sin. The child is not the sin, it's what they did. God announces that the child is going to die. By the way, nowhere does it really say that God is punishing the child but God simply says, this child will not live. David immediately puts on sackcloth and ashes. He chooses not to eat. He goes into terrible fasting. He's going through this whole mourning and grieving. And then one day, his aide comes to him and says, the child has died. David gets up, washes his face, changes his clothes into beautiful robes, gets back on the throne and goes back to work. And immediately they come to him and they said, this is inappropriate. And David says, no. He says, while the child was alive, I could intercede on behalf of the child, hoping that God would answer me. But now that the child is no longer here, there is nothing more that I can do for the child. I must get back to my work. All of us handle grief and mourning and loss differently. David was not saying this is how all of us should do it. He was simply saying, this is how I am dealing with my sin. This is how I am dealing with my loss. This is how I am dealing with it. And of course, we know that there was far more than that, because we'd have to know how he was dealing with Bathsheba, how he was dealing with his family and everybody around him. But he simply said, at this moment, he says, I am stepping up, because he said, I got to get back to work for the sake of the nation and my own sake. Matthew 6:22, don't collect for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but collect for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves don't break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. So if the light within you is darkness, how deep is that darkness? No one can be a slave of two masters, since either he will hate one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot be slaves of God and of money. Solomon, when Jesus is saying this, remember, Jesus is reflecting on all the scriptures that were written and shall be written, because that's Jesus, because he lives outside of time and space. And so he is commenting. But he's simply saying, he said, you have this ability. And he said, there's nothing wrong with wealth when you are using it for the sake of your family, your friends, for the sake of the gospel. He says, but when your money becomes more important, and we use this joke all the time. There was this librarian who had always wanted the job of the library because the old librarian just didn't know what she was doing. And so this new librarian comes in and she takes over and she gets all the library books on the shelves in perfect order, dusted, cleaned, and everything. But she won't allow anyone to take any books out of the library. Why? Because then it's messed up. What's the purpose of the library? Is it to be a perfect place where all books are dusted and in the perfect order? Or is it so people can check books out? And so Solomon says, the purpose of you having wealth is to take care of yourself, take care of your family, take care of the church, take care of the community, take care of those things which are your kuleana. And he says, the moment that it becomes the wealth, and this is interesting because a number of years ago, the best fight that we ever had at our Savior in the LWML was when the ladies were arguing. We had a new person come in from the mainland and they looked at the checkbook and the LWML had a bunch of money in the checking account. And Janelle goes, why do you have all that money? And they said, well, we've been collecting it for the last 45 years. And Janelle goes, we need to give it away. And they're like going, but once we give it away, we won't have it anymore. And she's like, does anybody know what our name is? Well, we are the Lutheran Women's Missionary League. She says, I'm not saying give all of it away, but she says, that's a lot of money. And I'm pretty sure there are some people, because the LWML hosted a bake sale once a month and all the money went, and then it was used for scholarships for kids at the school. And she's like, I'm pretty sure there are more kids who could use scholarships or kids who could use a little more scholarship. And the ladies were very reluctant because they were so proud of the nest egg they had. And Janelle talked him into giving a lot of it away. And it was interesting because then they got these little notes that came back from the kids saying, thank you for the scholarship. And of course, the mom and dad made the kids write the letters. But then the ladies sitting around there going, oh, wow, they appreciated what we did. And suddenly it was no longer about how much money we can earn just to put in the bank. It was about, maybe if we do this and this, we might be able to make a little more money because then we would have more money to give away. But I just loved that because I get this phone call from two people on both sides. One saying, this lady wants us to give away all of our money. Do you know how long we worked for that? And then this other lady going, Pastor, they really shouldn't have all that money in the bank. And by the way, it was not a huge amount, but back then it was. And I loved it because it got worked out so that good got done. And it inspired the ladies, by the way, to figure out ways to maybe gather a little bit more because they realized the more they had, the more they could give away. It was not about the more they had, the more they could save. It was the more they could give away. And that's what God is saying. He says, if your gift, by the way, is generosity, if I can trust you with a little, I can trust you with a lot. So he says, I understand that when somebody comes to me and says, God, you know that the reason that I don't give money to church is because I can't trust the church because I know that they're not doing your will. But I'm asking you to give me more money so that eventually I can bless the church. And God says, I couldn't trust you with a little. Why do you think I could trust you with much? Verse 19, God has also given riches and wealth to every man, and he has allowed him to enjoy them, take his reward, and rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God. I always have to stop here and say, obviously, God has not given riches to everyone. There are people in India, there are people in China, there are people in the United States who, and I'm not talking about those who have rejected it and those who have, chosen a life which brings them down to nothing. I'm talking about those who were born into such a poverty that they have no choice. And this is where sometimes we have to back up, because when we hear this, sometimes we have to say, no, there are people born in this world who have nothing and have no control over their life and don't own anything. And we have to be honest about that, which is why James says, we can't just say, well, go and be well. But he goes on and he says, but St. Paul has some words. I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that once again you renewed your care for me. You were, in fact, concerned about me, but lacked the opportunity to show it. And this is St. Paul. He's out on his missionary journeys, and he goes, I always knew you cared for me, but you didn't have an opportunity to show that you cared for me. And this is the church. Once in a while, we walk around, and within a very small group, we're talking about something that's broken. And we don't have the money in the budget to fix whatever it is that's broken. But it's only a small group that knows it's broken. And this group constantly talks about this. And then one day they're talking about it, and somebody's walking by and they say, what's broken? They say, oh, blah, blah, blah. And they said, well, what's broken about it? Well, it's broken and it can't be fixed. And they go, well, why not fix it? Well, we can't. Either we don't have the money or we don't have someone to do it. And this person says, well, I can do that. Either I have the money to give to fix it, or I actually have the expertise. Mark Westphalen, who was here this morning, getting ready to move to Kentucky, Mark showed up. We were getting ready to do what we thought was going to be a 2-week remodel of the nursery. It wound up being a 3-month remodel because we found electrical problems, termite problems, construction problems. Mark happened to be the vice president of a construction company, primarily working underwater, but evidently he could translate that to above water stuff. Mark happened to show up on the Sunday. We announced that next Saturday we're going to have our first work day. Anybody who, if you've never been to a work day, we're going to need all hands on deck because we want to finish this in 2 weeks. And Mark showed up that Sunday. He says, I'll be here to give a hand. And over the next 3 months, he was here during the week whenever he wasn't working, taking care of things that, by the way, us people had no idea what he was doing because it required a level of expertise. And this is what Paul says. Sometimes, as James says, we have not because we ask not. Other times, we don't have it because God says, wait, that the time is coming. And still other times, he says, no, you actually don't need it. This doesn't need to be fixed. This doesn't need to be replaced. But in this, we always know that God has a plan. And Solomon is saying that we need to understand that part of that plan is that occasionally we have to make sure that we let the world know what needs we have. We also need to let the world know what things we have. It's why every time we get ready to retire something here or get rid of something, when we had an extra piano because the Stillers generously helped donate this along with a bunch of other people that made it possible. We had a piano. Good Shepherd Lutheran Church needed a piano. They hired a truck. We loaded it up. They took it down. The piano now had a place of ministry. That's what we're looking at these days. It's about sharing. It's about understanding that God gives us things, and sometimes he gives us to us and stewards that we can share them with others. Other times he gives them to us because there's going to be a need here for that. Now, I don't say this out of need, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I'm in. I know both how to have a little and I know how to have a lot. In any and all circumstances, I've learned the secret of being content, whether well-fed or hungry, whether in abundance or in need. Paul is saying, look, I know you're planning on taking an offering for me, but before I go out and buy a new Corvette and a new multi-million-dollar mansion, I don't know what your offering is going to be. I don't know how much you're thinking of giving me. So before I do that, I need you to know that whatever you give me, I will use well. and I will make sure that it is used primarily for the ministry and not for myself. And that's what I love about Paul. He says, you didn't have the opportunity because you didn't know of any needs. Now that you're aware of needs, you're going to take an offering and give it. And I am thankful and understand that I have not set a minimum gift that you must give in order for you to be considered faithful. Whatever you give, we will put to use, because I also trust that God will move others to fill in any needs that we may have. I'm able to do all things through him who strengthens me. Still, you did well by sharing with me in my hardship. He's saying, what you did was step out in faith. I was ready to go on without your gift. We were figuring out how to make things work, but your gift will enable us to do things that we had not even envisioned yet. And so you have taken our what was going to be our ministry, and you've taken it up to another level. And this is why Paul wants to say thank you. Verse 20, for he does not often consider the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with the joy of his heart. Buechner again, where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need and the deep hunger. And this is it. He says, when you are doing what you love doing, the hours and the minutes just fly by. And people look at you and they go, how can you be happy? And you say, man, I just can't believe I get paid to do this. We have a guy in our church who's a pilot. And he is so happy when he's flying. I mean, the guy records everything about his flights. Can't wait to post a picture, a video. And he just loves talking about the places he goes and the things he does. And you look at him and you go, obviously, you really like being a pilot. And he says, I can't imagine not being a pilot. It's obvious it's his gift. We love that. And that's what Solomon is saying. When you are doing what you're doing and you love doing it, you don't go, oh, man, it's almost 5 o'clock. I get to go home. Yes, finally. Instead, it's coming up on 5 o'clock. You know what? I'm going to put in just an extra half hour because there's a couple of things I want to get done, and it'll make a huge difference in whatever I'm doing. So if you could do anything you wanted, what would it be? Just think about that for a second. At this moment in time, if you were given the gift of choosing to be or do something, what would it be? Because then comes the next question. If you could do anything you wanted, what would it be if you could go back when you were 10 years old, when you were 20, when you were 40, when you're 60? Think of the things that you wished you knew. When you go on YouTube, there's always the 10 things I wish I knew before I whatever. And most of them, by the way, are pretty nonsensical. But once in a while, we say, man, if I'd only known when I was 10, I'd only known when I was 20, when I was given this opportunity and I rejected it, when I was, I had a thought and that thought was a dream, but I chose this instead. And now I look back. And this is where what Solomon is saying is you may have made mistakes or you may have made choices that now you're regretting. And he says, instead of regretting them, figure out what choices you can make today that will create a place for you in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Because he says it's never too late. Because even, by the way, if I were to die tomorrow and I've got plans for next week, he says it's never bad to have plans for next week. Because he says then my life is not done. God may call me home, but next week I did have plans. This is why Luther said, he says, if you knew you were going to die tomorrow, what would you do? And Luther said, plant an apple tree. And they go, why would you do that? And he says, because that's on my list for tomorrow. And if it was important enough for me to do when I didn't know I was dying, it's important for me to do it, even though I now know that I'm dying. He says, my life should always be about the things that need to be done that I consider valuable enough and important enough. The book of Ecclesiastes actually ends here. This is the theme that Solomon is trying to share. You, no matter who you are, have a life. God wants you to enjoy it. We got a whole nother chapter to delve into, and we'll get to that after our one on spiritual gifts. But Solomon from here on is going to take all of this, which was in the theoretical, and he's going to make it far more practical in the sense of outlining and repeating, but putting a little more flesh on it, which is why he started off with meaningless, everything is meaningless, and he got our attention, and now he's got us down to the point where he said, eat, drink, and be merry, because you have no idea how long you're going to live. And if you are enjoying what God has given you, and the key is what God has given you, and you're using what God has given you for the sake of your own self, your family, and your world, he said, there is nothing better because the minutes will fly by. But he says, if all you're doing is sitting in the darkness, eating alone, plotting, and worrying, he says, then you are suffering and you don't need to. And so in a few weeks, we'll get back to it and finish it off. Aloha, hui ho.